Welcome to Crisis and Perception, where we examine the systems shaping our world.
Yeah, we're really glad to have you with us for this one.
Right. And, to start things off today, I want you to just imagine that you get hired for a gig.
Okay.
And to do this job, your manager tells you that you need to supply your own uniform.
Which is usually a pretty expensive uniform, right?
Exactly. It's a very specific, expensive uniform, and the cost is entirely on you. You just have to eat that cost.
Right.
But instead of doing that, you go online. You find an enthusiastic fan of your work, and you convince them to buy that uniform for you.
Which is already pretty clever.
Right. So then you wear it on the job, fulfilling your manager's requirement, getting massive free exposure for your own personal brand. And then, and this is the crazy part, when the gig is over, you take that worn, used uniform and you auction it off to a completely different fan for like a 500% profit.
It's a breathtaking piece of entrepreneurial judo. I mean, you've taken a forced business expense, right? And you've transformed it into this triple profit stream.
Yeah.
You get free wardrobe, free marketing, and high-margin retail inventory all at once.
And here is the kicker for you, the learner listening to this deep dive right now. That brilliant business hack, it didn't originate in some Silicon Valley tech incubator.
Definitely not.
And it isn't being taught in an MBA program. That is a daily survival tactic that was pioneered by a heavily marginalized workforce, a workforce that is currently basically writing the actual survival manual for the modern gig economy.
Yeah, they really are.
So today, we're looking at a highly stigmatized industry, and we're asking a question that I think will completely change how you view your own job. What happens when the adult film industry turns out to be a crystal clear preview of the future of work?
It's a huge question.
Yeah.
And it's one that requires us to completely shift our analytical frame. We have to put aside the cultural noise and just look at the actual mechanics of the labor.
Which is exactly our mission today. This custom-tailored deep dive is based entirely on the extensive research found in the book called Porn Work: Sex, Labor, and Late Capitalism. It's by Heather Berg.
And it is a fascinating read.
It really is. And I want to be very clear about what we are doing here today. We are not treating pornography as like a moral debate or a cultural issue or a scandal.
Right. That's not the goal.
No. We are looking at it strictly as a systems-level diagnostic. We're going to explore how economic design, incentive structures, algorithmic management, and the total collapse of the work-life boundary in this specific industry actually serve as an early prototype.
Yeah, a prototype for the labor structures that are reshaping all of society right now.
Exactly. And so what is the crisis in perception here?
Well, public discourse often frames this industry primarily as a moral or cultural problem.
Right. Always focusing on the stigma.
Exactly. But that surface interpretation completely obscures the deeper structure the book reveals. I mean, when the industry is viewed only through stigma or scandal, its role as a diagnostic model of the gig economy just entirely disappears from view.
It totally does. And systems analysis shifts that frame. Instead of asking whether it's socially acceptable, the deeper question becomes, what does this labor system reveal about the economic structures now reshaping work across all of society?
That's the real core of it.
Yeah. And just a quick note before we jump in, Crisis in Perception examines how systems shape belief and how better tools help us see clearly. This project is free and publicly accessible, so if you'd like to support the time, tools, and research behind Crisis in Perception, you can become a supporter on Patreon.
And for a shorter visual overview of this topic, you can see the mini explainer linked in the description.
Right, and if you enjoy this kind of systems-level analysis, please like, subscribe, and comment with books or topics you'd like us to explore next. So, getting back to it, if you want to understand the extreme endpoints of the freelance gig economy, you really have to look at the workers who have been living in those extremes for decades.
Decades, yeah.
This industry isn't an exception to modern late-stage capitalism. It's the vanguard.
Okay, let's really unpack this. Let's start by looking at the core paradox of the gig economy, because I think everyone listening to this has either experienced this themselves or they know someone who has.
Oh, absolutely.
A person decides they are just done with the traditional 9-to-5. They hate the micromanaging boss. They hate the rigid schedule, the cubicle.
They want autonomy.
Exactly. They want autonomy. So they quit to become a freelancer or an independent contractor or like an Uber driver. And what actually happens?
Well, they trade one human boss for a dozen algorithmic bosses.
Yes. And instead of working 40 hours a week, they find themselves working 24/7.
Right. And that is the central thesis Heather Berg presents in the book. The conditions that modern gig workers are experiencing right now, this supposedly radical, disruptive new economy. It's not new.
It isn't new at all. The adult industry has been operating in this hypermobile, precarious gig structure for a very long time. And what the research reveals is how workers adapt to that structure. How they hack it and how they redirect systems that are fundamentally designed to just extract their labor.
Right. And to really grasp how these workers became the ultimate case study in, hacking the hustle, I think we need to understand how the factory floor was built in the first place. Because this wasn't always an industry of independent contractors with ring lights and smartphones.
Not at all. To understand the current economic landscape, we really have to look at how the capital structure evolved over time. It's essentially a progression through three distinct eras.
Okay, lay them out for us.
So if we go back to the 1970s, you have what is often called the Golden Age.
Right.
This was an era of massive capital concentration. You had big budgets, actual theatrical releases in cinemas, and highly centralized control. This was often backed by heavily moneyed producers or even organized crime.
Right. I'm thinking of those movies that were grossing tens of millions of dollars at the actual box office. But I'm guessing the people actually on camera weren't seeing those millions, right?
They absolutely were not. And this is the critical baseline for our labor analysis here. Those massive profits stayed strictly at the top. Performers were paid very little, they had virtually zero negotiating power, and the barriers to entry for production were incredibly high.
Because you couldn't just use a phone.
Exactly. You couldn't just decide to make a movie on a weekend. You needed massive capital to buy physical film reels, expensive lighting rigs, editing bays.
And you needed access to physical theatrical distribution networks?
Exactly. The producers held a total monopoly on the means of production.
It's just classic top-down industrial capitalism. You own the factory, you own the profit.
Precisely. But then technology shifts the ground. We move into the 1980s and 90s, which is the video era.
The VHS boom.
Right. The invention of VHS changes the entire economic model. Suddenly, production becomes significantly cheaper. You don't need film reels or cinemas anymore. You can shoot on videotape and distribute via mail order or rental stores.
Which lowers the barrier to entry.
Exactly. This cheaper barrier to entry brings in a flood of new producers, and it births the concept of the true porn star.
Because suddenly there are VHS boxes on shelves, and the studios need brand recognition to sell them to consumers.
Yes, exactly.
Yeah.
Studios built massive advertising budgets to create these stars, and a very small percentage of elite performers were able to secure exclusive, highly lucrative contracts. It operated very much like the old Hollywood studio system.
Now, that sounds like a win for the workers, though. I mean, they get contracts and marketing backing them up.
Well, it was a win for a tiny fraction of them, the absolute top tier. For the vast majority, the video era was a double-edged sword. Because the technology was cheaper and easier to use, the labor pool exploded.
Supply and demand.
Right. The work became far less specialized. You didn't necessarily need the theatrical acting training that was required for the 1970s cinema releases. You just needed to perform the physical acts on a set. So for the average worker, bargaining power actually began to degrade.
Because the easier it is to make the product, the easier it is to replace the worker.
Exactly.
And if the worker is easily replaceable, wages stagnate. Okay, so we have the monopoly of the 70s, the video boom of the 80s and 90s, and then the internet arrives.
And the internet just detonates the entire studio business model.
Right.
This brings us to the digital and platform era, from the mid-90s to today. This shift crashed studio profits completely. You had the emergence of these tube sites. These platforms basically aggregated and pirated studio content, offering it to consumers for free.
Wait, hold on. Let me stop you there and get into the actual mechanics of this. Because if the tube sites are pirating the content and giving it away for free, how is anyone making money? I mean, how did the studio survive to even hire these gig workers in the first place? Walk me through the cash flow of that crash.
It was a brutal transition. The tube sites operated on an ad revenue model. They gave the video away for free to generate massive web traffic, and then they sold banner ads against that traffic.
Wow.
Yeah. And the studios, who had spent hundreds of thousands of dollars producing this high-quality video, got absolutely nothing. Their DVD sales plummeted. To survive, the established studios had to drastically slash their budgets. The era of the lucrative, long-term exclusive contract vanished almost overnight.
So the safety net is completely ripped away. The workers are just cast out into a hyper-competitive, low-paying freelance market.
Yes. But, and this is the crucial turn here, while the studios lost their monopoly on distribution, The workers gained access to the means of production.
Right, the cameras got cheaper.
The barrier to entry plummeted to near zero. Anyone with a digital camera and eventually just a smartphone could produce their own content. With the rise of direct-to-consumer platforms, workers were no longer dependent on a studio executive to greenlight their career.
Which brings us to a really heavy academic term that Heather Berg uses in the book, which I want us to clearly define for the listener right now.
Oh, pornodialectics.
Yes, pornodialectics. What does that actually mean in the context of someone just, trying to pay their rent?
So dialectics essentially refers to an ongoing tension or struggle between two opposing forces that are constantly adapting to one another.
Okay.
In this context, pornodialectics is the crafty, relentless struggle between the workers and the managers. The managers design a system to extract maximum labor for minimum pay. Then, the workers figure out a loophole to protect their time and maximize their earnings.
And then the managers spot the loophole and close it.
Exactly. And then the workers invent a new one. It is a constant game of economic cat and mouse.
Let's ground this with an example, because the book has a brilliant one regarding those old exclusive studio contracts we just talked about.
Oh, the trade scenes.
Yes. So say a performer is under contract with a major studio. The studio pays them a set rate, and the contract says, "We own your output. You cannot go work for our competitors." But the legal wording specifically dictates that she cannot do paid work for competitors.
Right. Because the studio's trying to lock down her market value. They don't want another company profiting off the brand name they are spending money to build.
Makes sense from their side. So how does she hack the dialectic? She sets up what are called trade scenes. She calls up her friends and colleagues in the industry, and they film extremely high-quality scenes together for absolutely zero pay.
They just swap their labor.
Exactly. No money changes hands.
Which means she isn't violating the letter of her studio contract. She isn't doing paid work for a competitor.
Right. But why would she do that? She needs to make a living, right? Here is the genius part. She takes all this incredible footage she filmed for free, and she just hoards it on her hard drive. She sits on it for months.
And then waits.
And the very second her restrictive studio contract expires, she releases all of it independently. She floods the digital market with her own content, reaping 100% of the profits and completely undercutting the studio that just spent the last 2 years marketing her name.
It perfectly illustrates how workers are not just passive victims of the gig economy, they are highly active agents. They read the contracts, they locate the blind spots in the platform's rules, and they exploit them.
It's amazing. But, let me push back on this idea of digital liberation for a second. Because right now you're probably thinking, if anyone can shoot a scene on an iPhone and distribute it globally in 5 minutes, doesn't that just flood the labor market with infinite supply?
It does.
Doesn't that drive wages straight to the bottom? It sounds less like a worker revolution and more like the Uberization of intimacy. I mean, if there are 100,000 new drivers on the road tomorrow, my fare as a driver is going to plummet.
Your intuition is entirely correct. And the workers interviewed in the book are hyper-aware of this dynamic. The democratization of production means intense global competition. Wages for traditional studio-directed scenes have compressed significantly over the last 2 decades.
Wow.
Yeah. Today, the primary weapon managers use to suppress wages isn't a monopoly on cameras. It is the omnipresent threat of replaceability.
Which makes the very definition of what they are doing so fraught. There is an incredible insight in the book from a performer, author, and activist named Connor Habib. He talks about his own internal journey with how he labeled himself in the industry.
Oh, the terminology is so important.
He says that initially he vastly preferred to be called a porn star. He liked being thought of as a constellation instead of a laborer. He explicitly did not want to associate his life with the drudgery of straight work.
And that sentiment goes right back to our opening paradox. Why do people flee the 9-to-5? Because they hate the alienation of the wage labor system. They don't want to view their sexuality, their creativity, or their bodily autonomy as just another widget moving down a corporate assembly line.
Exactly. But then Habib's perspective makes a radical shift. He realizes that by avoiding the word work, you actually strip yourself of your political and your economic power.
Right.
He argues that as long as workers misuse the term work, meaning they actively try to take more from the job than the job takes from them, they can erode its extractive power. Claiming the title of worker isn't admitting defeat, it's the prerequisite for demanding better conditions.
What's fascinating here is, if we zoom out, this is the exact legal and cultural battle happening across the entire gig economy right now.
Yes.
Are Uber drivers independent entrepreneurs, or are they workers? are freelance graphic designers, small business owners, or laborers. When a massive tech platform insists that you are a constellation or a partner or an entrepreneur, they aren't doing it to flatter you.
No, they're not.
They are doing it so they don't have to pay you overtime, provide workers' compensation, or offer health insurance.
Wow. They weaponize the prestige of independence to deny you the rights of labor.
Exactly.
Okay, so if the overarching structure of this industry is basically a massive, decentralized gig platform fueled by the threat of replaceability, let's walk onto the actual factory floor. When these independent contractors show up for a studio gig, what does the reality of the labor look like?
The reality is that the physical and emotional toll is immense, and it is intentionally hidden from the consumer. The final product is edited to look seamless and effortless, but the process of manufacturing it is grueling.
Berg goes into deep detail about the sheer amount of waiting. You aren't just showing up and performing for an hour, you are sitting around on a set for 10 to 12 hours.
Right.
And during that time, you have to maintain physical readiness and arousal, which is biologically and psychologically taxing.
And you are expected to perform unpaid labor while you wait.
Unpaid labor, like,
Well, for instance, the book details how performers are routinely expected to shoot promo stills. These are the glamorous solo shots or promotional images used for digital thumbnails and marketing. The performers are rarely paid an extra hourly rate for this modeling. It's just expected as part of the day's gig.
well, wait. If they are independent contractors, why don't they just say no? Like, my contract is for the video scene. I'm not doing a free photo shoot.
Because of that mechanism we just discussed. Replaceability.
Ah.
If a performer pushes back on the unpaid labor, they know exactly how the producer will respond. The producer will smile, finish the day, and then never hire them again. Because there are 100 people behind them willing to do the free promo stills just to get a foot in the door. The threat of replacement is how managers manufacture compliance without having to negotiate.
And on top of the unpaid waiting and modeling, you have the intense physical labor of the scene itself. We are talking about executing complex, highly strenuous physical positions specifically angled for a static camera lens and holding those unnatural positions for long, repetitive takes.
Yeah, it's very athletic.
It's athletic work that frequently leads to chronic joint pain, muscle strain, or acute injury.
But importantly, the burden of that factory floor is not distributed equally. The book introduces a vital concept here: the hierarchy.
It's such a striking, provocative term. Let's break down what it actually measures.
So the hierarchy describes a highly stratified labor market. It dictates everything: who gets cast, what pay rate they can command, what status they hold in the industry, and what level of physical safety they are afforded on set.
And it's not based on skill.
No. This hierarchy is fundamentally built on racial categorizations, gender dynamics, and rigid body type norms.
The traditional studios operate with very specific, often deeply exclusionary static rules.
They do, and this results in a system where marginalized performers, black, queer, trans, or fat performers, consistently face the absolute worst treatment and the lowest pay from traditional studio bosses.
And how do the managers justify this?
They point to the algorithm. They claim they are merely supplying what the market demands, using biased data or perceived consumer prejudices to sanitize and justify racist casting practices and massive wage gaps.
Which creates an incredible, crushing emotional strain on the set for those workers. Berg documents a phenomenon that performers refer to as "here's the meat."
It's awful.
It's an intensely alienating experience described by performers of color and trans workers, like Venus Lux. They talk about walking onto a studio set and realizing immediately that the director doesn't see them as a human being. They are completely reduced to fetishized body parts. You are a person collaborating on a scene. You are a demographic category to be filmed and categorized into a specific search tab.
And to survive that level of dehumanization, workers have to perform an incredibly complex tightrope walk of emotional labor. They have to master the skill of simultaneous connecting and distancing.
Let's use an analogy here because simultaneous connecting and distancing sounds a bit abstract, like the compartmentalization of an ER doctor, right?
That's a good way to look at it.
You have to be fully physically present to diagnose and treat the trauma patient, but you have to build a complete emotional wall so you don't break down crying when things go wrong.
That is a highly accurate comparison. In this industry, the performer must physically simulate authentic, burning desire for the camera, and often to coddle the ego of the director while simultaneously maintaining a deep, internal, emotional detachment.
Right.
If you fully internalize the alienation of being treated like meat, Your mental health will shatter and you will burn out immediately. You must build that emotional wall to survive.
But here is the catch that the ER doctor doesn't face. If the camera or the consumer sees your emotional wall, if they detect that you are detached and just clocking in to pay the rent, you are deemed a bad performer and you lose your livelihood.
Exactly. The labor is the concealment of the labor.
Yeah.
And the physical conditions they endure behind that emotional wall can be brutal. There's a story in the book that perfectly encapsulates the calculus of capital versus labor.
Oh, the lube story.
Yes. A director, point blank, refused to allow the use of water-based lube on a set. They insisted the performers use silicone lube, even though silicone lube can cause severe friction that literally tears the performer's skin.
And the reason the director gave for this, for forcing them to use something that tears their skin.
Because water-based lube might damage the furniture they had rented for the set.
It's breathtaking. The furniture is a capital asset. It costs the studio money to replace it. The gig worker's skin is a replaceable commodity that costs the studio absolutely nothing if it breaks.
It is the rawest distillation of how a purely extractive labor system views the worker.
But this is where the diagnostic gets truly fascinating to me, because these marginalized performers don't just accept this treatment. They don't just suffer through torn skin and racist pay gaps. They use the tools of the digital era to build an escape hatch. When they face a glass ceiling or outright hostility from traditional bosses, they pivot. They become what Berg calls worker managers. They buy a camera, they set up a direct-to-consumer subscription site, and they start self-producing their own content to bypass the gatekeepers entirely.
It is a logical survival strategy. If the traditional industry won't cast you fairly or treat you safely, you hire yourself.
I understand the survival instinct, but let's look at the systemic outcome here. By escaping a rigid boss through self-production, these performers just become the boss. They escape the assembly line, but their solution is to build their very own assembly line right in their living room.
This brings us to a crucial theoretical tool in the book. The Marxist feminist geographers J.K. Gibson Graham developed the concept of anti-essentialist class analysis.
Okay, let's unpack anti-essentialist class analysis, because traditionally class is viewed as fixed, right? You are either the proletariat sweating in the factory or you are the bourgeoisie owning the factory.
Exactly. But Gibson Graham argue that in modern gig economies, those class positions are completely fluid. They are not essential to your identity. They change based on the hour of the day. In this industry, a performer's class position shifts constantly.
Give us an example.
Well, at 9 a.m., a performer might be on a major studio set, operating as a vulnerable gig worker, being subjected to the meat phenomenon, and having their surplus labor extracted by a wealthy producer.
So they are the exploited proletariat in that moment.
Right. But then at 5:00 p.m., that same performer goes home, sets up their own ring light, and hires another independent performer to shoot a scene for their personal subscription site. In that moment, they have crossed the desk. They are now the manager.
Wow.
They are the one holding the capital, paying the wage, and extracting the surplus labor from someone else.
And because they are now worried about their own profit margins, they might find themselves replicating the exact same extractive behaviors they hated that morning. They might get annoyed that the worker they hired is taking too long in makeup, or they might try to lowball their day rate to keep their subscription site profitable.
Right. When you become the check writer, your perspective aligns with capital. It is a profound realization. Simply democratizing the tools of production, giving everyone a camera, doesn't automatically dismantle capitalism. Sometimes it just creates millions of micro-capitalists who are all flawlessly exploiting each other.
Which brings up a massive contradiction in the product itself. We've just spent 20 minutes detailing the intense physical toll, the emotional compartmentalization, the brutal gig economy hustle, and the complex class dynamics of producing this content.
Yeah.
And yet the consumer scrolling on their phone expects to see something completely natural and spontaneous. How do you make a highly manufactured industrial product look totally authentic?
That is the core paradox of modern intimate labor, and it extends to influencer culture, customer service, and beyond. The modern consumer has grown deeply cynical of highly produced, glossy media. They demand realness. But simulating a completely authentic, unscripted experience on demand requires an immense amount of highly skilled, entirely invisible labor.
There is a quote from a performer named Sire that really struck me in the text. A bad performer is actually a good performer.
Let's break down what that means, because it sounds counterintuitive at first.
Right. A bad performer in the traditional sense means someone who isn't hitting their marks, isn't looking at the camera, isn't delivering perfectly lit angles. They look messy. They look real.
Right.
Sire is saying that someone who is so skilled at their job that they can seamlessly simulate messy reality is actually doing incredible top-tier work. But because it looks so real, the consumer refuses to acknowledge it as labor. They just think, oh, they're just having fun.
And managers use this consumer demand for authenticity as a highly effective labor management tool. This is a critical diagnostic for the wider economy. If a manager can convince a worker that they love their job, that they're just being themselves, they can leverage that passion to extract more labor for less pay.
This is the ultimate trap of do what you love.
Precisely. Berg illustrates this by contrasting mainstream Los Angeles porn with the rise of DIY, feminist, or queer alt porn. Now, alt porn markets itself as an ethical alternative to mainstream, glossy fast food porn. Right. And because it's framed as a passion project for the community, the monetary pay is often significantly lower than what a mainstream studio would offer.
Wait, let me make sure I understand the mechanics of this. You are hired to do the exact same core physical job, but because the set is labeled ethical, you get paid less money.
Yes, and the extraction goes even further. Berg notes that in these DIY or alt settings, because the product is supposed to look natural and unproduced, the performers are often expected to do their own styling, apply their own makeup, provide their own wardrobe, and even do their own digital marketing for free.
The labor hasn't disappeared. It has just been shifted entirely onto the shoulders of the independent contractor, unpaid, under the guise of authenticity.
Exactly.
This perfectly mirrors the modern late capitalist corporate ethos. Let's really flesh this analogy out. It is exactly like working at a trendy tech startup.
The startup culture is the perfect parallel.
You get hired at an app developer. The office has exposed brick, a ping pong table, and free kombucha on tap. The CEO wears a hoodie and tells you during onboarding, "We aren't a corporation. We are a family. We are disrupting the industry and changing the world."
Right, the mission.
And because you buy into that narrative of passion and family, you feel guilty asking for overtime. You answer Slack messages at 11:00 p.m. You work 80-hour weeks for a mediocre salary with no 401k match.
Capital cynically appropriates the worker's deep human desire for fulfilling, meaningful work and weaponizes it to extract unpaid surplus labor.
Exactly. Compare that startup to a boring, soulless corporate job at a regional logistics firm. The logistics firm doesn't pretend to love you. They don't have ping pong tables, but they pay you exactly the high hourly rate you negotiated, and at 5:01 p.m. you clock out, go home, and they never text your personal phone.
That is exactly the calculation many performers in the book make. There is a very telling quote from a performer named Lily Cade. She notes that, given her identity, she initially assumed she would end up working entirely in queer or alt porn. But she consciously chose to work in the mainstream LA porn industry instead.
Really? Why?
Because the rates and the conditions are better. Her quote is incredibly blunt. She says of the mainstream industry, "We're not full of shit. People know that we're here to make a product."
She prefers the honest transaction of alienation. Pay me my union right, I will simulate the fantasy you require, and then let me go home to my actual life. Don't ask for my soul at a 20% discount.
It is a profound critique of how modern workplaces weaponize culture and passion to erode labor rights.
Okay, let's pivot and follow the money because I'm genuinely confused about the cash flow here. We established earlier that tube sites decimated studio budgets, meaning even the better-paying mainstream scenes pay significantly less than they did in the 90s. If a paid studio scene doesn't cover the rent anymore, what is the actual economic model for these workers? How do they survive?
The economic model has fundamentally shifted. For most workers today, paid studio scenes are no longer the primary source of their income. They have become loss leaders.
Meaning they take a financial hit on the front end to make money on the back end. The scene is just a billboard.
Exactly. A performer might accept a low-paying studio scene because the studio, despite its budget cuts, still commands a massive global distribution network and SEO presence. The worker is buying visibility.
Ah, I see.
They then use that studio visibility to drive internet traffic toward what Berg calls satellite industries.
What exactly falls under the umbrella of satellite industries?
We are talking about ancillary revenue streams where the worker captures the profit directly. This includes feature erotic dance at clubs, webcam modeling, independent escorting, and critically, direct-to-fan subscription platforms like OnlyFans or ManyVids.
So the economics of the hustle require the performer to act as an independent conglomerate. They're managing a vast portfolio of diverse income streams just to piece together a living wage.
Yes. And what is fascinating from a business perspective is how the title of porn star functions as a highly leveraged brand asset.
Hmm.
Most performers don't make millions of dollars in residual royalties from their films, but being recognizable, having that studio credit, allows them to charge premium, vastly inflated rates in those satellite industries.
That makes total sense.
A recognizable performer can charge 10 times more for a private webcam session or command a much higher guarantee for a featured dance gig than a worker without that brand visibility.
So what you're saying is they are using the big studio's own marketing budgets against them.
Exactly.
The studio pays to film and distribute the scene, hoping to grind out a tiny profit margin off ad revenue on a tube site. But the worker uses that massive global exposure to funnel superfans to their private paywalled platforms where they keep 80 to 100% of the money.
It is the porno dialectic in action. The workers are using the structure of the gig economy to wrest control over their own labor. Instead of fighting a losing battle with the studios for a slightly larger slice of a shrinking pie, they bypass the middleman entirely.
It's the exact same mechanism as the modern music industry. An independent musician puts their new album on Spotify, knowing Spotify pays literal fractions of a penny per stream. They know they will never pay rent from streaming royalties.
Right.
But they have to put the music on Spotify to get the algorithmic exposure. Why? So they can build a fan base that will buy a $50 t-shirt and a $150 concert ticket, because the artist actually controls the profit margin on the merchandise and the live show.
That is the perfect analogy.
Mhm.
The recorded content is just the marketing funnel for the live, direct-to-consumer interaction. But, just like the independent musician, this decentralized model forces the worker to take on massive overhead.
Right, because Spotify isn't paying for the tour bus.
Exactly. The studio isn't paying for your wardrobe, your travel, your healthcare, your camera equipment, or your constant social media marketing. You bear all the risks and costs of doing business.
Which brings us right back to the hook we opened the show with. The underwear dialectic. Let's re-examine that now that we understand the pressure these workers are under to manage their own overhead.
Yes, the underwear dialectic is a brilliant example of grassroots worker hacking to manage that overhead.
Okay, so the studios slash their budgets, they displace the cost of wardrobe onto the gig worker, telling them, bring your own lingerie. This is a massive out-of-pocket expense.
Huge expense.
The worker hacks this by putting the lingerie on an Amazon wish list. A fan buys it. The worker wears it on the studio set, getting free exposure while fulfilling the boss's requirement. And then they auction the worn item back to a superfan at a premium.
The brilliance here is the subversion of extraction. The studio thought they were extracting free capital wardrobe from the worker. Instead, the worker inverted the system. They used the studio's platform to turn a sunk business expense into a high-margin retail product.
But let's look at the dark side of this entrepreneurial hustle. Because if you are your own brand, if your income relies entirely on your ability to constantly funnel fans from free platforms to your paid subscription sites, when do you ever get to clock out?
You don't. And that is perhaps the darkest, most urgent preview of the future of work that this industry offers us. When you become the product, the boundaries between life and work completely disintegrate.
Because the labor is no longer bounded by the 10 hours you spend on a physical studio set.
Berg describes this state of existence as a constant audition. When you are a freelance gig worker whose primary asset is your own personality, aesthetic, and accessibility, you are always on the clock. There is the relentless self-marketing, the daily social media management, the physical maintenance hours spent at gyms, salons, and skincare clinics that are essential to maintaining your market value, and the constant emotional recalibration required to engage with fans online.
The paradox is just staggering to me. These workers enter the industry saying, I refuse to work 40 hours a week in a cubicle, and their reward is working 100 hours a week on their phone.
Exactly.
There is a quote from the performer Stoya in the book that captures this perfectly. She acknowledges the trap, saying she is always working, but it's also almost always really fun.
Which is a very dangerous psychological space to occupy because
Yeah.
it masks the exhaustion. To understand this, we need to look at another concept from Marxist feminism: reproductive labor.
Let's define reproductive labor for the listener. Traditionally, this referred to the 19th and 20th century factory model, right?
Yes. Historically, reproductive labor meant the unpaid domestic work cooking the meals, doing the laundry, raising the children, providing emotional support that was usually performed by women in the home. It was the necessary unpaid labor that reproduced the male worker, allowing him to wake up rested, fed, and ready to go back to the factory line the next day. Capital relied on this unpaid labor to keep the factory running.
Okay, so how does that concept map onto a 21st century gig worker operating a subscription site?
In the modern gig economy, the concept of reproductive labor expands to encompass your entire existence. Because consumers demand authenticity, your daily life becomes the content. Your self-care routine isn't just about resting, it's a monetized vlog post. Eating your dinner, walking your dog, going to the bathroom, taking a vacation. It all becomes raw material for the brand.
It is exactly like modern influencer culture. If your life is your business, taking a vacation to Hawaii isn't actually resting. It is a high-pressure opportunity to shoot a month's worth of vacation content to feed the algorithm.
Exactly. Venus Lux have a very poignant observation about the bone-deep exhaustion this causes. She says, you're eating dinner? Take a picture. You're going to the bathroom? Take a picture. Sometimes you lose a sense of enjoying the moment.
That's heartbreaking.
When your private life is the inventory for your storefront, you surrender your privacy completely. The psychological strain of being a walking, breathing advertisement for yourself is immense.
How does a human being maintain any sense of a core private self when their very identity, their hobbies, their political opinions, their sexuality is constantly being optimized to please a recommendation algorithm?
It is incredibly difficult. However, some workers find ways to use this total visibility disruptively. Because they control their own social media platforms, they don't have to present a sanitized, corporate-approved version of themselves like they would in a traditional PR campaign.
Right.
The performer Vex Ashley points out that fans can no longer pretend that performers are just passive, compliant fantasies that exist only for the viewer's pleasure. Because of social media, she notes, it is public record that many performers are acerbic, snarky communists who do not stand for bullshit.
I love that. They weaponize the algorithm. They say, you want access to my life? Fine, but you're going to have to acknowledge my humanity, my politics, and my boundaries.
It is a potent form of digital resistance, but it highlights a terrifying vulnerability. This entire ecosystem, this delicate balance of self-managed gig work, of hacking the hustle, of asserting digital independence, relies entirely on having uninterrupted access to the internet.
You need access to social media to market, banking apps to get paid, and web hosting to store your content.
Precisely. Which brings us to the final and most precarious aspect of this diagnostic. What happens when the state steps in?
We have to look at the role of government regulation and surveillance, because workers in this industry operate at a truly terrifying intersection. They face violent state surveillance on one hand and total state neglect of their labor rights on the other.
Yeah, it's a dangerous intersection.
Let's look at the physical regulations first. Things like California's Measure B or OSHA mandates requiring condoms on set. To a casual observer, that sounds like a victory for workers, right?
Yes.
Workplace safety regulations. But the workers interviewed in the book largely fought against state intervention. Why?
Because you cannot divorce the regulation from the cultural stigma. Historically, state protection in this industry has almost never meant punishing an abusive boss or ensuring fair wages. It has meant criminalizing the worker.
So they don't trust the state.
Right. When the state gets involved, they don't view performers as legitimate laborers who need safety goggles. They view them through a lens of moral panic. They view them as a public health risk that needs to be surveilled and quarantined.
There is a devastatingly clear quote from Nina Hartley in the book regarding these mandatory health regulations. She says, "We're pornographers. We know that you hate us." It's this deep, lived realization that the lawmakers drafting these bills aren't acting out of solidarity with labor. They are acting out of moral disgust.
And that cultural stigma pushes workers away from institutional protections. If a traditional worker is assaulted on the job, they call the police or file an OSHA complaint. Sex workers often cannot do that because involving the police might lead to their own arrest or the confiscation of their tools.
That's terrifying.
Therefore, they are forced to rely on informal community networks for safety. They build peer-to-peer whisper networks, crowdsource blacklists, and private forums to warn each other about dangerous directors or clients.
But those informal safety networks live entirely on the internet, and that is where the state brings down the hammer with digital censorship laws. Let's talk about SESTA and FOSTA, because this is a masterclass in how government regulation can inadvertently destroy gig workers.
SESTA and FOSTA were federal bills passed in the United States, billed by politicians as anti-trafficking measures, a universally supported, noble stated goal. But we have to look at the actual legal mechanism of the law to understand the fallout.
Let's get into the mechanics. What did the law actually do?
It fundamentally altered Section 230 of the Communications Decency Act. Previously, internet platforms were generally not held legally liable for the content their users posted. SESTA and FOSTA changed that. It made platforms legally and financially liable if their networks were used to facilitate sex work or trafficking.
Okay, so the platform is now on the hook for massive federal lawsuits if a user breaks the rules. How did the tech companies respond?
With absolute panic. Rather than risk federal prosecution or massive legal fees trying to moderate every single post, platforms engaged in a catastrophic enclosure of the digital commons. They initiated massive purges of anyone even suspected of being a sex worker.
Wow.
And we aren't just talking about specialized adult ad boards. Mainstream infrastructure companies panicked. Airbnb, PayPal, Venmo, Google Drive, Instagram, they all started freezing funds and terminating the accounts of independent adult creators.
Let's pause and look at the terrifying double bind this creates for the worker. The state refuses to classify you properly as an employee, so you can't get basic workers' comp if you tear your shoulder on a studio set. You're entirely on your own.
Right.
But the state will use federal law to force Google to delete your cloud storage where you keep your independent content. They will force Venmo to freeze your bank account, instantly cutting off your ability to pay rent or buy groceries.
And what is the economic result of that digital enclosure? It destroyed the workers' ability to independently market themselves. It destroyed the whisper networks they used to screen dangerous clients.
It totally isolated them.
By cutting off their digital autonomy, the state effectively forced workers to abandon their independent businesses. They were pushed back into the hands of exploitative traditional managers who had the legal resources to navigate the new laws, or worse, they were pushed into highly dangerous street-based work just to survive the week.
The book mentions an initiative called Liara's List. Because they couldn't rely on the state, sex workers had to literally crowdsource instances of tech discrimination tracking, which banks were closing accounts, which hosting sites were purging data, just to figure out how to navigate the digital landscape and survive these algorithmic purges. It is pure, desperate survival mode.
And closing the digital commons always empowers capital and endangers the worker. When the independent gig worker loses access to the platform, the traditional monopoly boss regains all their leverage.
Which brings this entire journey full circle. We started today looking at a highly stigmatized, marginalized industry, something that polite society usually pushes into the shadows or dismisses as a moral failing. But when you look past the stigma, what we actually found was a massive, high-definition mirror reflecting the future of all work.
The elements of the modern economy are all there, operating at maximum intensity. Hyper-precarious gig labor, the shift from human management to algorithmic surveillance, the relentless, exhausting demand for personal branding, the total collapse of the boundary between your professional life and your private identity.
These concepts didn't start in a Silicon Valley tech startup with beanbag chairs and free kombucha. They were pioneered, navigated, and hacked first by marginalized sex workers.
Applying a systems-level analysis shifts the frame completely. Instead of asking whether pornography is socially acceptable, we must ask what these workers' survival strategies, their porno dialectics, teach the rest of us.
Right, the survival guide.
They are writing the playbook on how to identify blind spots in platform algorithms, how to build community networks when institutions fail, and how to fight extraction in an increasingly freelance, platform-dominated world.
They are showing us how to survive when the system is fundamentally designed to squeeze you dry. But it leaves us with a really heavy, provocative thought to mull over for you, the listener. We've talked about all these incredible hacks to escape the traditional boss. But if the ultimate goal of the modern gig worker is to completely bypass the studio, to become your own brand, your own manager, and your own product, do we actually achieve freedom?
Or, in our desperation to avoid being exploited by a massive corporation, have we simply learned how to flawlessly, relentlessly exploit ourselves?
When you become the boss of your own life, you might find you're the most demanding, unforgiving boss you've ever had. You break your arm, the x-ray shows the jagged line, but your first thought isn't about healing. Your first thought is figuring out how to monetize the hospital visit for your subscribers. That is the true diagnostic of the modern economy. Thank you for joining us on this deep dive. Until next time.